Hello again, and welcome to the next episode in the American National Catholic Church's Renewing the Spirit. Today, I asked Father Mark DiStefano if he might join us for a discussion on the significance of this, what is in the preface of the Mass, tells us is this joyous season of Lent. It seems almost like an oxymoron for many of us grew up with the emphasis on penance and sacrifice and giving up candy. But I wanted Father Mark perhaps to join me in this discussion so that we might talk a little bit about what are the goals of our Lenten journey. Father Mark DiStefano joined the American National Catholic Church, comes to us from the Society of Jesus, is a academician for most of his career, is a polyglot, a linguist, right? And has brought to the American National Catholic Church all of his skills and talents. He is our vicar for the Spanish apostolate, as he's fluent in Spanish and English, so that's a great help to us. He also participates in our formation team and is a faculty member in the American National Catholic Theological Institute, teaching a number of courses to those preparing for orders and for our lay men and women who choose to take our courses with us. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Father Mark, and perhaps he can introduce himself in terms of how he found the ANCC. What that might mean to him and his priesthood and ministry. So, without further ado, Father Mark.
Great blessing in my life. After I left the Jesuits, I was looking for a way to continue to express my Catholic tradition in a lively way. I wanted to maintain my priesthood. And actually, through meeting Father Paul Guglia, through another friend, another person at St. Peter's, I met Father Paul Guglia, who was at that time, fortunately, in charge of vocations. And we chatted. I visited. I came to a come and see weekend, and right away fell in love with the ANCC because I found that it maintained all of my Catholic traditions that I loved, that I knew so well, that I had really dedicated myself to, and but in a very special way, the ANCC being very welcoming of all people. And I really like that about the church. I have found that to be one of the most refreshing aspects of the ANCC, that it's just so welcoming to everybody.
And thank you. I really think that all of us who have found the ANCC, the American National Catholic Church, have reported the same experience. That there's a tremendous sense of welcome in which there is an invitation to belong, and I think that's a part of how you and I grow up in terms of our experiences as Catholics. And so, and not that our Roman brothers and sisters have lost all of that, but there's a greater emphasis in some ways for us, as well as the reality of acknowledging our humanity in very different ways, especially for clergy. So we're so happy that Father Mark is with us and that he's taking the time to join us today as we come to the end of the first week of Lent after Ash Wednesday. Father Mark has a very busy day today. He's going to be teaching a course in Pauline literature, Pauline theology, right after this. With I think there's 8 people in that class, which is very good for us. So what I was thinking, Father Paul, that you and I might begin to talk a little bit about how this Lenten season really is a 40-day retreat. Father Mark and I have had some exposure to Ignatian form of prayer and spirituality, and in religious life, mostly all of us do a 30-day retreat following the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think the method might bring some important understanding to bear on how we move through Lent, because the goal of all prayer is union with God in some way. And the goal of our Lenten journey, I like how the Pope Francis puts this, is that every one of us during Lent joins the pilgrimage of all of those men and women who've gone before us. in our desire to grow closer to God through this season and celebrate with great joy the mystery of Easter. So I was thinking that maybe for us, we were taught that the three ancient disciplines of Lent are prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And growing up, that meant giving up candy, not fighting with my sister, um, doing what my parents asked. As we began to grow, I think our spirituality began to kind of shift and change in important ways in which we recognized that God was really calling us to a conversion of heart, to a conversion of mind and heart. And this is what I love about the readings in Lent, especially from the Hebrew scriptures, mostly from Isaiah and the prophet Joel and Wednesday. God is trying in this Lenten season to help the people of Israel remember who they are, to remember that they are God's chosen and that God will be with them and protect them. And for us, in this very divided time, it might be good for us to remember who we are as Christians. We mark our foreheads with the sign of the cross on Ash Wednesday. But what does that mean for the rest of Lent? So I'll turn it over to you, Father, and maybe you have some thoughts to offer.
So, Bishop, you mentioned so many things when I was thinking about this whole topic of Lent. So many things that really strike a chord with me. And even though we say it half tongue in cheek about the disciplines of Lent, penance, prayer, of course, the fasting and so forth, I think for many Catholics, for anybody who knows anything about Lent, we think about that. Again, if you stop and think about the word penance, right? So it's poina, right? So punishment. And again, it's this idea of punishment and kind of joining in the satisfaction of the cross and so forth. And yes, I think that these elements are very important, but I think sometimes, especially for people in a modern sensibility, and especially in a modern society, right, a developed society, this idea of having to join in the bloody sacrifice of Christ really bothers some people. I think it's a turnoff for a lot of people. And so I like to recast it in some ways, and you've already mentioned that, right? And I think this goes very well with who we are as members of the ANCC and also Ignatian spirituality, what St. Ignatius of Loyola had to say about this. And that is giving my life completely to Christ, completely to Jesus on a daily basis, but to do it in such a way that I completely transform myself. And I think, to me, the beauty of Lent then, it's not just about, put myself in a corner and beat myself up. I don't think that's the point of it at all. And, while there's an element of, yes, it's, controlling myself to some extent, I think that the other side of it is really, it means taking a special time in the year when I can really think about how I can put God first again in my life, as much as that's possible in the life of my real, actual living circumstances. And to me, that's really a central thing. How can I make Christ the center of everything every single day? And in a sense, every single moment. And to me, that's the challenge. It's not, oh, can I give up, as you said, candy? Can I not fight with my sister? Yeah. I mean, in a real way,
Yeah,
I think that's really what it is.
sure.
On a daily basis, when I'm driving to work, can I remember, right? So, can I not get angry at the person who cuts me off? I remember there was a wonderful parishioner, one of the parishes I worked. I said to her, sometimes when people do that, I get so angry. She said to me, there's an easy response to that, Father. When you look over at the next car, just pretend that Jesus is the one driving.
Oh, goodness.
I have thought of it so many times,
Yeah.
but again, it's this, trying to put God at the center of everything and to do it in a, as Rana would say, in a thematic way, to do this in a conscious way, in a special way. I think, in a sense, that's where the penance comes in. That's where the prayer comes in and the gratitude, right, which I think are very much a part of Lent. I've got to, there's no way that I can do this unless I'm speaking with God all the time and trying to keep God at the forefront. And this is so Ignatian, right, as you mentioned. So, and Ignatius was another big one, right? So, he said in a very real way, we're not just on retreat, for, the time of the 40 days. The retreat is every single day, and for him, so he said, "Oh, I'm living right. So I'm constantly living my spirituality. It's alive for me at every moment." So to me, those are the beginnings of, Lent, so to speak, but in a sense, it carries over into the rest of our lives.
And that's the goal, right? I think that's brilliant how you framed that. As you were talking, I was thinking that, for us as adults, as mature adults in the world, and growing in a sense of our spiritual maturity, that our penance sometimes really is about self-examination and correction, and how you describe the transforming nature of grace in our lives. How we don't necessarily reject the theology of the cross in the way that we have learned that was Christ's all-embracing love for us, and that he went so willingly, and that as you and I, maybe in the history of Catholic spirituality, there were different moments in that history in which the more physical aspects of that sacrifice were highlighted. And then as we grow and as society begins to look at that particular act, it really is about how does our participation in our own suffering, which is just natural without inviting any more, reflect our willingness to correct our own faults. And I was laughing because after last night we had First Friday, and we had adoration and benediction along with Stations of the Cross. And afterwards I went to confession, and then I was driving home, and it was only about 10 minutes, and I'm screaming like a lunatic about people who were, and I thought, well, so much for character corrections. But yes, Father Mark, I just think, and Father Mark and I have the benefit of the exposure to Ignatian form of prayer, but I'm a Franciscan, and so Francis invites us during Lent to really contemplate the cross, not just in terms of the physical and the ignominious way that Christ died for us, but in the fullness of the embrace of the cross. Behind me is the San Damiano cross, which is, as you know, for Franciscans, so meaningful in terms of Christ speaking to Francis from that. But if we look at the breadth of Jesus's arms, it's all inclusive, and so Francis sees in Christ's birth, death, suffering, and resurrection a way that draws all creation to God, every aspect of creation to God. And so this frame, I really appreciate the frame that you put on this in terms of our prayer, almsgiving, and penance is about self transformation. It is about moving through Lent in a way that allows us to continue this after Lent, right, and to really change our hearts and our minds. Yeah, yeah,
I'd like to return to that idea of, the kind of the bloody sacrifice too. Why I think, for most of us, we're not going to be confronted with the reality of martyrdom.
mhm,
And so I think, people in a modern context oftentimes will push that to the side and say, oh, that's not the reality of my life and so forth. Agreed. So I mean, I'm actually going to take it up, even though, I was raised in the Ignatian tradition very much. But one of my favorite, theologians actually is Duns Scotus,
yes,
right? And
yes,
I think about him. He said, would Christ have come even if there were no need for the cross? And
yes,
and Scotus says very clearly, absolutely, Christ would have come for love, for love. And to me, of course, we all know this. That is the meaning behind the cross, in a sense, that Jesus is willing to give up everything for the sake of love. And to me, that is the real challenge. If I can't even control myself on the road for a few moments, how again, for me to make this into a practical spirituality, I need to say at every moment, and you mentioned it even in the political circumstances, how can I be loving the way Christ was loving in every moment, for every immigrant, for
yes,
every person who looks different than I am, for every person who has a different nationality, a different language, a different sexuality, maybe even a different state of life, which I think, again, I want to pull this back to the origins of the ANCC and so forth, a church that invites everybody, no matter what. And we've all been knocked around in life. And that's, I think, where the ANCC comes in and says, we're going to take you no matter where you are. And again, we're going to take you. You're going to be accepted and welcomed
Yeah.
if you are willing to come to us. We're going to try to mirror that love of Christ in a
Yes.
very special healing way.
Yes. And the idea that Bonaventure and Duns Scotus uh, don't necessarily contradict Augustine's notion of atonement,
Yeah.
but add to it that God was so compelled by his love for us that he wanted to be one with us, and so he sent his Son to participate fully in the human experience. That his love compelled him. It's interesting to think that God is compelled by his love for us, but it is, and that's the goal of Lent, is to realize how much God really does love us, right? And I often quote Oscar Wilde, who, when he saw the Catholic Church, he said, "Here comes everybody," right? And so I was thinking about, the early, because yesterday was the feast of St. Perpetua and Felicity, two young women. Perpetua was 21 years old. She had just given birth. She was nursing her child. Felicity was pregnant. And they were so transformed by their encounter with Jesus Christ that they did go to the Colosseum and were martyred. And then after the persecutions, there was something that we called the white martyrdom, the fugamundi, people fleeing the world. And even in this day and age, you and I might not be called to physical martyrdom, but we are really called sometimes to denial of self in a way that recognizes the needs of the other in our life, as Martin Buber might say, right? In the I and thou. And also, I think that this assurance of God's promise of protection and being with us and sustaining us. Your strong right arm upholds me. You're my rock, my stronghold. It can be for us sometimes almost a warrant to relax and say, this is an easy way to get through Lent. We say in the church, if you and I as a priest fail in something, ecclesia suplex, the church will provide, right? So we might rationalize, oh, I don't have to do that. God will take care of that. But the reality is that the challenge of Lent is to fully participate in what God has called us to be, the fullness of who we are, and to see, as Ignatius says, God in all things. And I like this. I like the frame of how Lent is really, honestly, I think it is the transforming of relationships, right? It is in its essence, a growing relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. But not only that, then how does that impact my relationship with everyone else?
And I think you've circled right in on it, at least in my estimation, the way I see, Christ's mission too. It's about, putting other people at the center of everything, right? And, I always take it back to even to the synoptics, right? The oldest of the synoptics, Mark's gospel, right in the beginning, in the first chapter, right? When Jesus says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you," right? So a fisher of human beings, right? Of persons and so forth. It's interesting. The Greek verb that he uses there, right, that the writer of Mark's gospel uses is aphiemi, which means, right, so actually to forgive, to
Mhm.
forgive. And the same verb, that's exactly the same verb that's used in the Our Father. So I always say, for me, that's Jesus making a proclamation of what his mission, what his life is, what his life task is, and to come follow me, and I will make you a forgiver, a reconciler of human beings. And so, for us, I mean, I think this is exactly, it's the whole framework of life for everybody, but especially during the Lenten season, if I can bring that to the forefront again,
Mhm.
it's something that we've always got. But again, Ignatius too. This is so much a part of him, right? So, contemplation in action, he said, right? So, as I'm doing these daily tasks or something, I'm also constantly being invited to be a forgiver, a reconciler in God's world. And I think that involves everybody. So I have to forgive myself for my own
Mhm.
shortcomings,
Yes.
and I think that's a major task for all of us. It's easy. I can say, "Oh, I forgive somebody else." For me to be able to say that deep down about myself, That's another, remember on retreats, I'd say to people, okay, we're going to do a little exercise here. Take a sheet of paper, divide it into two columns. On the left, tell me all the good things about yourself. On the right, tell me all the bad things about yourself. And of course, I give people 5 minutes, big retreat thing, right? And of course, in 5 minutes, they come up with 400 things. Oh, well, Father, I'm this, and I'm terrible. I'm this. So what about the good things? Oh, well, my cat likes me. It's like, yeah, got it. Right. So again, I think this is part of the mission of the Lenten journey. And to me, it's, I know that people say, oh, it's going out into the desert and it's following that example of Jesus. I think when Jesus goes out into the desert, he's going there to be closer to the Father and to the Spirit, and also to bring that love of the Trinity into focus so that he can bring this into the fullness of his mission. For us, I think it's kind of the same thing. I'm not going into the desert. In a way, my desert has to be with everybody around me all
Sure.
the time. And, I've got to focus that love of God, that forgiveness of God for me and then for other people. And I need to be modeling that and living it. And to me, that is, as you said, that is the suffering. That is
Mm,
the difficulty. It's so much easier just to blow somebody else off
sure.
rather than to take it to heart. Oh boy. So, in a very real way, I think it can be just as you said, it's compelled by love, and it can be just as demanding as even facing, a bloody martyrdom in some ways.
I,
Although we do pray again for those parts of the church that suffer,
yes.
that do suffer actively now in the world. And now, given the current, political climate of the world, I think we need to ask ourselves, am I participating in the suffering of others?
And the oppression of others. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm doing that, then I need to step back and say, hey, I need to get in step with the forgiving, loving Jesus. And nothing can be beyond that. Nothing, no political agenda, right?
It is the ground of our being, as Rana says. And here, the other thing I think that you touch on so really brilliantly here, Father, eloquently, is this idea that our suffering in our desert. I think the most arid of deserts sometimes is my own inward movement in terms of recognizing really maybe perhaps things about myself that that really do separate me from all of the people who surround me. And that's the challenge, and that's painful.
And
And I'm so glad you brought it up in terms of the persecuted church, because there are people who give their life for the church, and I shouldn't say for the church, for the for the person of Jesus Christ, in the context of the lived sacramental presence of the church. And so it may not be for you and I, but here I agree. Here is for you and I the challenge. If we mark ourselves with the sign of the cross on Ash Wednesday, and then we wash it off in the evening, and on Thursday we pick up our life without any changes, we kind of continue to participate in unjust systems, or we continue to support oppressive policies, or we join those who will marginalize even further those who are already on the fringes and the edges, rather than to welcome the stranger, to give drink to the thirsty, to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, without judgment, simply moved by love. We may be ridiculed. We may actually be attacked. We really may be accused of things that perhaps are not even in our experience. And so our martyrdom might really come not unlike Bonhoeffer in terms of really standing up to a system that seeks to dominate and oppress rather than to give fullness of life.
And you said before too, and I think it's so central. Confession.
Yeah.
I think honestly, I love confession, verbal confession, not just communal confession. I think it's a really beautiful, wonderful sacrament. And so to me, it's so central to the Lenten experience, especially to be able to come to that moment when I can admit to myself and to other people aloud. Again, Ronner's thing of thematizing, to admit aloud, and then to get the response of someone else. And again, I think this is where it's so important for us as priests. It's not for me as the priest to be sitting there screaming at the person, you shouldn't have done this and this and this and this. It's not at all. Just the opposite. It's the sympathetic, loving voice of Christ that I'm supposed to be representing as the priest, to be encouraging and to try to help the person slowly to work through those individual difficulties that are constantly going to come up. And again, let's face it, I don't think for most of us, we're not going to get rid of these things in our lives completely, right? Most of us, our sins are going to come back to visit us, so to speak, or us to revisit them. That's okay. I mean, Ignatius used to say that, get up, stand up. So, sacate el polvo, right? So, brush yourself off and get on with it. Get on with life. Never mind, shove myself in a corner, beat myself down. Oh, I can't do this. Oh, I'm so bad. I'm such a horrible person. That is not helping you or Jesus or the church community, the loving community of Jesus, or the world, which is so much even beyond all of that. Get up and do something positive. Accept the love of God that forgives you, right? That forgives me. To me, that's what Lent is all about. It's this kind of restoking of that fire, that kindling inside of
Yes.
me.
Oh, I love that. And it's so true what you say about forgiveness. I like that when you and I grew up, certainly it was called confession. Now the church has named that reconciliation. And I think that's the emphasis, right? It isn't for us necessarily to reconcile ourselves with God, because that act on Calvary was once and for all. We can't add or detract
Yes.
from it. However, the sacrament does allow us to reconcile ourselves with ourselves and then with others. And what you're saying, maybe the one of the goals of Lent for us is to begin to see ourselves the way that God sees us, to begin to see ourselves and others with the eyes of love that God sees us with, and to forgive ourselves. It really is the hardest. I often tell my clients that you can't give what you don't have. And so, in terms of wanting to forgive, perhaps maybe that begins with understanding whatever your role was or whatever, right? And that's I have a dear friend in Philadelphia who's very, very secular, but tremendously ethical. And she says to me all of the time, forgive everyone for everything all the time. And I'm like, boy, isn't if we did that, we'd be much happier. We'd be much happier. This is this reframing of the Lent, hopefully for our listeners, might invite them to a more genuine Lenten experience, and to follow Christ into the desert, Moses for 40 years, Isaiah on the way to Horeb, all of these narratives of our spirituality speak about taking time apart so that we might return. There's a meme I read. I think it's a meme. I'm not sure how you call it, but butterflies don't fly in the rain because it might do something to their wings, so they rest. And maybe this 40 days is a period of rest in terms of which we might encounter ourselves in the desert, and not solely for ourselves, but to bring those gifts again to the church. When I was in the novitiate, one of the friars lived with us, and we have a very developed notion of the vow of poverty. Francis talks about Lady Poverty. He sings in a medieval way about Lady Poverty, and I remember one of our older friars commenting that one of the brothers in the house, the way that he understood his vow of poverty would be to drink soured milk, and then the older friar said, and then we're in the emergency room having his stomach pumped, and he missed the forest for the trees because the cost of the emergency room was greater than getting a new gallon of milk. And I always remember that. And by the way, the brother who drank the milk was earnest and sincere, and God was in that, absolutely. But perhaps the season of Lent we can use some critical thinking relative to our experience with Jesus Christ, and to think about the person of Jesus Christ. I think we tend to have a very or I tend sometimes to see only Christ in his divine nature and not his human nature. And so the mystery of the incarnation is to recognize that Christ came and assumed everything that we are. And as Irenaeus of Lyon said, that because he assumed all of us, all of us can be redeemed. And I think that's an important aspect of Lent, is to find self-forgiveness, not in a way that pats ourselves on the back and excuses us. Because I do think in my particular order, we had a chapter of faults,
Mhm.
and that was a public proclamation of where
Well,
we had failed in the rule. I think it was designed to bring us again into deeper relationships in the community, but also to recognize that when we think we are following the rule perfectly, we fail sometimes. And we do need some people to say, hey, like that was really terrible, or and to hear that and listen to that and think critically about that. One of the things that I remember in seminary, one of our classmates gave a homily, and do you remember those bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I love that question for myself now, because what would Jesus do, right?
and if you stop and think, too, even at the end when we give absolution, remember that the church's theology, unless the person chooses to accept that forgiveness,
Mm.
it's not effective. Now, I've had people kind of go crazy about that, people with scruples. But again, it depends on me, the sin that cannot be forgiven. I always say, in a dramatic way, it's not giving God the finger. Oh, that's, hey, no problem. The sin that cannot be forgiven is I will not let God
Mm.
forgive me because I think that I'm not worth it. And then that's in a sense, it's kind of denying everything that God and Jesus are all about. And so I think it's really important. Spiritual direction, as I
Yeah.
say, the sacrament of reconciliation, confession, the participation in a community. It makes it a broader thing. It's not my relationship with Christ, me and you and I, that kind of, Buber's thing, right? So I and thou. Yes, but as Buber says, it's so much more than that. It's I
Oh,
and thou, but it's in the community.
sure. It's in
So I mean, I
community.
feel like Lent is really that too. Take, yes, look at myself and try to forgive myself in the way and love myself the way that God does, so that I can be effective and forgiving and loving to the whole community. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely, Father Mark. And as you're talking, I'm understanding that if we can, maybe for a moment reframe Lent in the way that we're talking about it, in particular you, it also reframes the sacraments of the church in understanding the life-giving nature of the graces that they offer us all of the time. And so Lent is not a participation in something that's obligatory, but rather something that is inviting. So when, for us, the supreme prayer of the church is the Eucharist, right? It is a God who gives himself to us in love. The sacrament of reconciliation, I know many of our Protestant brothers and sisters don't quite understand what that what the need is for that. And the need for that is not so much that God needs to hear it or the priest needs to hear it, but I need to hear it. And then what the invitation from the priest to forgive yourself is astounding. There's a principle in Catholic theology known as differentiation of consciousness. So whatever true for a believing community will evidence itself as true in subsequent communities, but not in an anachronistic way. And so you and I, around the same age, we grew up with the God transcendent, right? And the God in the monstrance. And then Vatican II came, which were pretty much dedicated to those reforms. And all of a sudden, it was the God in our midst. It was the God present to us. It was the God who calls us into community. And in the documents of Vatican Council II, it actually says that the first presence of Christ in our midst is the people gathered in prayer. And so, this idea that Lent might be an invitation for us to remove the burden of obligation and begin to see a movement towards relationship that is compelled by love.
Yeah, and a real meditation of, as you said, of the value of all of the sacraments. to revisit what did it mean for me to be baptized, even as a child. What did that mean for me to be baptized into that mystery of, the death of Jesus, but Jesus who's going to, right, who's been risen, who's going to come back again. As you said, the Eucharist, so many, they have these polls out, even Catholics that don't believe in the real presence. Well, maybe it's because we don't spend enough time thinking about that, and especially sitting with Jesus and spending time to try to make him the center. Maybe that will bring it more into focus, especially in a community setting, right? This anamnesis, all of us praying together, that power of community prayer that brings, the Eucharist to life, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's really important for me to be a part of this. And that's what I love about the ANCC too. It's a very intentional church. If I'm going to be in the ANCC, I'm going to do spiritual reading. I am going to participate in the sacraments. I'm going to be expected to voice opinions, to share in the conversation. And I think that's right. So that's so Ignatian, right? It's also very Franciscan, right? The conversation, the spiritual conversation.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's what, in a sense, Lent is kind of a first step of what could be every single day and
Sure.
should be every single day. And I love the ANCC for that. It's not just show up and walk out. No,
Mhm.
no, no. I show up, and because I guess, again, we're blessed in a certain sense of being a smaller church in that way, of saying, hey, I'm doing this because I really want to be here, not because
Exactly.
I'm just fulfilling, as you
Right.
said so many times in this, an obligation that has come to mean nothing to me. Well, I shouldn't say that, but you know what I mean.
No,
It's an obligation that has been mitigated in some ways because of the doing it over and over again, but not really thinking and reinvesting myself in the true meaning of that. And I
yes.
think that's why study is so important too, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Go back, study the traditions of the church, talk about them.
Understand them. What is it that we're doing, right? Just don't follow. and
Mm.
and when you talk about that for us in the ANCC, when you say everyone, that includes everyone, right? Not just the clergy.
Yep.
So many of our retreats are led by a member of the parish who has significant gifts to bring to us. So I think the American National Catholic Church, in some ways, is attempting to move towards the reforms of Vatican Council II because she gave the church back to us. But what does
Mhm.
that mean if I won't participate in the gift that was given to me, right? And so,
Yeah.
so the obligation of love to me feels a greater sense of compulsion. In Franciscan life, obedience is conceived that way. We don't do it because we are told to do it. We do it because we are compelled by love and we could not do otherwise. And
Right.
and for Ignatius, one of the most beautiful prayers that I think has been derived from his spirituality is your the former Superior General Pedro Arrupe, who says
Mm.
that the most practical thing that you and I can do is fall in love and fall in love with God, because
Yeah.
when we do, it changes everything, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Lent is about. It's this falling in love again. It is about finding again not the harm and the damage and the critical perspective. That's easy to do, but it's finding the wealth and the goodness of what resonates for us.
You fall in love with everybody around you then too. I think it's really it's funny, I was driving by and there was a guy, I had to go to a nearby mall a couple of times. I'm in a rural area, and well, part of where I live is sort of rural. And there was a man who was just sitting out in a wheelchair out by the road. And as cars were going by, he was waving. And the first time I kind of waved back, and then I had to go back a second time. So as I came back the second time again, there was this guy out there, and it struck me again. I really slowed down the second time, and I put down the window, and I waved. I said, "Hi, how are you?" I thought to myself, in some ways, yeah, it's crazy. Maybe it's something simplistic. I thought it was so important, though. Right? Obviously, this man was looking for love and human connection. He needed that.
Yes.
And if everybody would just take a moment or just stop, there isn't a single one of us that doesn't need that.
Oh, Father, so
Human love, human connection. And that is so Christ-like to me and so central to who we are as a church.
Yes.
And, I mean, I just yeah, sorry.
No, no. Tell me.
Yeah, so I feel like, if I can do that every single day, if I especially, we've come on this theme so many times with the situation today, this all of this anger that people have and hatred and, pushing people away. Wait a second, we're talking about other human beings here.
Right.
Come on.
Created
I
in the
mean,
image of God, right?
yes, I mean, the way we're treating immigrants these days, really? I mean, I've been working with Hispanics the better part of, my life, 50 years. Oh my goodness. I hear people say, oh, they're lazy. Oh, they're slovenly. The Hispanics that I know, I've seen them 3, 4 jobs
Oh, sure.
trying to, the parents trying to get the family, have them be, have opportunities in education. Oh my goodness.
Sure.
I mean,
And I
come on,
remember
these are human beings.
my family came over from Ireland. They were being starved, right? And
Of
so
course.
they worked like crazy. Father, but when you talk about this, and I know you and I could go on and on and on, right? I always blame it on kissing the Blarney Stone, but I think you have so much to offer, Father. But you know, I've been chaplain at a psychiatric hospital. We were the first Catholic community to celebrate Mass in Spanish for the ICE detainees at our county jail. And I have chaplaincies at two, a skilled nursing facility, a retirement center. And I think about the abandonment of age. And I think I want to do a podcast on Richard Rohr's spirituality for the second half of life. But what you're saying is true. Um, I was asked to go and just have a meeting with a gentleman who had many questions about his faith, and the reality was he didn't have any. He just wanted me to stay with him, right? And I don't mind, right? And then I was asked to anoint a gentleman who was dying, and his wife was with me, and I was so aware of the healing nature of touch when we anoint the forehead and the hands. The gentleman just sighed. It was this wonderful sigh. But these individuals who have been so marginalized by age or race or even creed or stigmatized by mental illness. I've been up at that hospital probably for 15 years. And I go and I give ashes, and I always ask the person's first name and they'll tell me. So on Wednesday, I gave ashes to Jesus, to Solomon, and to Muhammad. And I think, okay, I got the trifecta. But the reality for us is it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. And we always do a little kind of penitential service. What does this mean? And I invite them to participate. But as you talk about, that's the conversion of heart is in very simple ways. And I think, you and I grew up being taught lessons in civics and civility, and there's an absence of that. And so I just think that I believe it was one of the famous movie stars that if you can be anything in the world, be kind. And maybe that's an invitation, right? To just be kind. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Just this, as you mentioned too, this beauty of what human being, right? So we have that, as you say, ashes. Who of us is not going to wind up dying?
Mm,
No matter what their fate. I mean, there are so many ways in which I would say almost everything. We are the same no matter whether it be a Hindu or a Muslim. Yeah, sure,
absolutely.
we have different ways of getting to God. I've heard people say, oh, everyone absolutely needs to be a Christian. Okay, I understand. I know the significance of Christ. I kind of go a lot with Rana, right? So kind of the anonymous Christian, so to speak. But I don't mean that in a, that we look down on other faiths. Just the opposite,
Right.
right? It's him saying there were different expressions of God, different expressions of Jesus. And the church is big enough to bring all of that in, and especially all of these, as you say, marginalized. Remember John Paul, right at the end, he was drooling and so forth, and
I was with
they
him.
kept pushing him. Yeah, why don't you give up the papacy? Why don't you give? And one of the, I think, really beautiful things that John Paul said was John Paul II, was I think it's important for the world to see me in my old age, in my brokenness. This is what it means to get old and to really have to depend utterly on God. Oh,
Really,
beautiful.
it
Oh
was
my
beautiful.
gosh.
And I agree with you. I was with him near his death in Toronto,
Oh,
and you're
wow.
right, the witness of that, and it really is antithetical to the values of this society, where you can't be too rich or too thin, right? And so or too young. But yeah, absolutely, Father. I think we could go on and on and on, and I am so appreciative of this time of conversation and gentle discussion about a God who
Thank
loves.
you, Bishop.
When do we do this, Father? I mean, it's so remarkable to me. I know that Father Mark is going to teach a class now, and I really want to invite all of you who are listening to us to maybe find the American National Catholic Church. Our webpage is the capital THEANCC.org. I would invite you also to look at our American National Catholic Theological Institute, in which everyone is invited to take courses, and that's www.ancti.org. I would invite you. Father Mark is also a co-pastor at St. John the 23rd in Philadelphia, and I happen to be pastor at St. Francis of Assisi in Glenridge, and as well as the presiding bishop. So I just would invite you to please participate us. We have 14 parishes throughout the country. We obviously don't have them for everyone everywhere, but if you're interested and you want to begin a parish, for us, that planting model starts with the people of God. And then we move from there. Because we are so Eucharistically centered, it is essential for us to have someone who can confect the Eucharist for us, and for that, as Catholics, that's a priest. But anyway, I just invite you all and to participate with us. And we're on iHeart, Spotify, Substack. So I try to get the same name, but if you look for the American National Catholic Church Renewing the Spirit, and on Substack, I think it's maybe it's Bishop George Lucy, but in any case, please find us and join us. But again, thank you so much, Father Mark. And I think maybe in this Lenten season, to conclude this particular podcast, maybe we can just say an act of contrition as a way that acknowledges our desire to move in the transforming graces of this amazing season full of life and light for us. So, oh my God, I am
I
heartily
am heartily
sorry
sorry for
having
having
offended
offended thee,
because
and I
I
do
dread
test
the loss of
the
heaven
loss of heaven
and the
and the
pains of
pains of
hell,
hell,
but most of all because they
because they
offend you, my
offend thee,
God,
my God,
who are
who
all
art all good and
deserving of all.
deserving of all of my love.
I firmly
I
resolve,
firmly resolve, with the
with the help
help of
of
thy grace,
God, to confess
sin no
my
more,
sins, to
to
do my
avoid any
will,
occasions
and
of
to
sin.
end my life. Amen. So Father Mark and I different versions regionally, right? But it was all this act of sorrow for our faults and a desire for reconciliation and restitution. Father Mark, thank you so much, and God bless. We'll
Thank
see
you,
you.
Bishop. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
everybody.
Bye bye.